Thank you very much, June. I love it when a presentation is so complete and thorough that it answers every question before the presentation's over. So we really appreciate you coming out and wish you well in your work at the Reagan-Udall Foundation. I think it makes a lot of sense and will be very helpful to patients as well as all of us in the industry going forward. So again, thank you. We're now going to move into a little bit of some sessions like we did yesterday, where we have a couple of TED Talk type quick discussions and then a moderated Q&A afterwards. The topics for this morning are data science and global health. So we're going to start on the data front and would like to introduce you to Dr. Joe Singer. Joe is the Chief Medical Officer of HealthCore, which is Anthem's wholly owned outcomes research subsidiary. Joe is active in many national health policy discussions, and at Anthem he focuses on health outcomes research, pharmacoeconomics, and pharmacoepidemiology policy and program development. So please help me welcome Dr. Joe Singer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here this morning. I really want to talk about accelerating the development of relevant evidence in healthcare with evidence on relevant. There are a broad array of constituencies that make decisions regarding healthcare, and each one of them has their own lens when they look at data and when they look at the information that's presented to them in publications. And the relevance is different depending upon whether a physician, a payer, a regulator, a patient. Most important thing is really keeping the focus on the right priorities. I was trained as a primary care physician, medicine and geriatrics, and then I went on to run several health plans, and now I'm dedicated to health services research. And my compass, my northern goal has been really that key relationship when we look at strengthening the relationship to make good decisions between the physician and the patient, giving them the information that they need, that they can personalize the interventions that are going to be presented to the patient by the physician in a fully informed manner. As we build evidence to power these decisions, there are multiple lenses that we look at. And again, keeping that patient-physician relationship as our northern key in the compass helps us do things appropriately. When we look at the innovators, they decide on where they're going to invest their money, how they're going to invest their money, what products they're going to go after. When we look at regulators, they're going to look at what do they need to approve a product? What are the issues that are important to address regarding effectiveness, efficacy, safety? When we look at payers, they look at what are they going to pay for? How are they going to prioritize multiple interventions within a single therapeutic area that could be very different, not only from a pathophysiology and treatment perspective, but in cost of care. When we look at the physician-patient relationship, what's best for that patient? How is the physician going to decide from a myriad of interventions what would be most appropriate for that patient? And that was one of the most challenging things that I dealt with as I taught in the residency program, as I treated patients. The lack of information on specific patient characteristics to make that decision. And then we have our patients. Do they have the information that they need to decide whether or not they're going to get treated or not? Do they understand their disease? Do they understand the different interventions? And then once they start therapy, are they going to continue therapy? And that is a huge challenge nowadays. When we look at the evidence required from the regulators and the payers, those requirements are not aligned. The FDA looks at what is efficacy, what is safety historically, and that's critical information. But when you look at the payers, they look at effectiveness in a real-world setting. They look at safety. They look at the economic impact of an intervention, not only the intervention itself, but the downstream consequences of that intervention from the adverse events, as well as mitigation of progression or even potentially curing the disease. And they look at the overall impact of that product. And there's a mismatch in the type of information that is relevant to those entities. And what we're doing now is attempting to develop methodologies that will align the information in a timely manner. Payer decisions are really embedded within a host of other decisions. Treatment guidelines that are published by the professional societies serve as their guidelines for developing their own internal medical policies. One of my jobs at Anthem is help to develop some of the payment initiatives, payment innovation initiatives, and looking at those quality gateways that are part of every single initiative that we deal with is based upon treatment guidelines, because we want to make sure that appropriate care is being given. And then the performance-based reimbursement is based upon physicians' ability to align the outcomes of their treatment with what we expect. When you look at some key areas where we spend billions, if not tens or hundreds of billions of dollars a year, a lot of work has been done in various reviews looking at the evidentiary material available for those guidelines. So many of these guidelines are based upon expert opinion as opposed to randomized controlled trials, pragmatic trials, other types of evidence. And they're key areas of spend. Now, I looked at different reviews, Cochrane reviews, other types of reviews, to find the most optimistic view of what percentage of guidelines were based upon true evidence as opposed to expert opinion. Now, there are some people who will say it's never more than 15%, but these are the most optimistic reviews. And you can see, even in diabetes, which is the highest percentage, it's a little bit more than half, and that is very optimistic. And if you look at the opioid epidemic that's hitting our country, there's very, very little scientific evidence on how to intervene in an effective manner. It's predominantly expert opinion. When you look at clinical trials, they are essential for the regulatory approval process, and they leave us with a lack of clarity. We know what's happening in a very small group of patients over a limited period of time in a very controlled environment. But utilization occurs really in that post-marketing environment where variations in how the drug is used and the patients receiving the drugs, in comorbidities, compliance, will compromise the potential efficacy into what is the real-world effectiveness. And some of the barriers may be as simple as cost of the drug. Others are the burden of illness itself and adverse events of the drug. So it's a very complicated issue. When we look at the precision coming out of clinical trials, physicians are looking at a patient in front of them, and population-based healthcare is very, very different than delivering personalized healthcare to an individual. And when we look at the phenotype of patients, age, gender, comorbidity burden, other drugs they're taking, their historical compliance with therapy, it gives us many different phenotypes of patients as we go along. And clinical trials give us the average benefit to a patient and an average risk to a patient, but necessarily, it doesn't necessarily give us the information needed to treat patients on a population other than the homogeneous population that was enrolled very scientifically into that clinical trial. And we can see that based upon many factors, there can be variable effectiveness of a drug, and clearly the risk can be very different for populations, so that in developing a treatment plan for a patient, unless a physician can get this sub-segmented information, risk-benefit information, they can't inform their patient on really what's the best way to manage their condition. Here's a soundbite for your tweets and your Twitter people. Clinical trials tell us if a product works, probably, and if a product is basically safe, just not in whom. We've seen several drugs pulled from the market that are great drugs, but we could not identify who the at-risk population was, and because of that, the drug was pulled from the market, when in fact it could have been very, very beneficial to others. Happened to my son. He was taking a drug, a great drug for a serious problem, got pulled from the market, and he was having a perfect clinical response. The drug approval now that we're going through is expensive. It is timely. It is inefficient, and it can take 10 years from discovery to get to an approval process. And that's not even talking about the time from approval to actually incorporation into clinical practice. What we're looking to do is really develop a methodology to improve the relevance of the evidence being generated. People use the word or the term real-world data, real-world evidence interchangeably. I make a point in differentiating them. Real-world data is really the data that we collect from the everyday practice of medicine, from electronic health records, from patient surveys, from health plan operations, where we get claims with diagnosis and CPT codes and procedures, and the drugs that are actually dispensed to the patient, as opposed to the drugs that are ordered through the EMR. And there's a great disparity between what patients actually pick up and what the doctors think they're taking. And gathering that data together, we perform sophisticated analytics to generate that evidence in a real-world manner. So technically speaking, our clinical trials are real-world data, real-world evidence, but in a very limited population. It's difficult to extrapolate to patients beyond the characteristics of those included in the study. There are shifting patterns of how we collect evidence now and generate evidence. June, I've got you up there, so you're in my slide. We've been involved at HealthCore with the Sentinel initiative since it was the mini Sentinel. Anthem is a very strong data contributor to the initiative. PCORI and PCORNet are really not only looking at research projects, but methodologies and systems to become more efficient in deriving and creating this evidence. And fortunately, we're involved in working with several practice-based research networks and integrating them with health plan data so that we can really address issues that cannot be otherwise resolved in an efficient manner. EvGen and Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative are evolutionary concepts that hopefully will be able to advance this going forward in a more efficient manner. The evolutionary thing that we've been dealing with in the near-term drug approval process is development of pragmatic trials, whether you want to call them pragmatic trials, observational studies. I leave that to my epidemiology and biostatistics associates. They can differentiate the nuances, but really bringing in a approach to bringing in evidence in a practice-based setting that would be complementary to everything that's done in the clinical trials, so that we can talk about microsegmentation of the population. We can look at the effect of comorbidities, the burden of other drugs, and bring in a tremendous amount of insight that would otherwise be unachievable through the traditional mechanisms. The revolutionary process, and I differentiate evolutionary from revolutionary. We've been involved in discussions where these pragmatic trials, real-world studies are incorporated into the pre-approval process, so that if you remember the conflict in evidence requirements by regulatory agencies and the payers and providers, by introducing pragmatic trials in parallel or in quick succession to the clinical trials, a tremendous amount of data will be able to be developed and identified in a manner that will expedite the acceptance and utilization of these products. Once health plans and providers are able to understand and differentiate between products, their uptake will become much, much quicker. The current process on formulary development is rapidly changing with the advent of accountable care organizations, patient-centered medical homes, bundled payment initiatives. Physicians, integrated delivery systems are looking for much, much more sophisticated data so they can set up their internal guidelines, complementary that's done by the professional societies, but what they feel is their best approach to managing their patients. And by incorporating these pragmatic and observational studies earlier in the development phase of a product, it really will give them the information that they need much, much quicker. We're doing these now. We're randomizing at an individual patient level, as well as site randomization. Again, there are nuances to the power and the epidemiology and the statistics of how you do that randomization, but it improves the several confounders and channeling biases that a retrospective study alone may not be able to address. So really, this type of discussion is ongoing. I've been at many meetings at Reagan-Udall and with the FDA, looking at how we can advance this. And we just initiated a study with hopefully 3,200 patients in a prospective manner in chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It's the biggest in that therapeutic area. So it's clearly where we think the information needs to be derived, and the revolutionary process will be bringing it earlier into the drug development process. To close out, really accelerating the generation and dissemination of information is critical. We understand that for the life science industry, it's too expensive, it takes too much time, and even once a product is approved, to gain market access, to gain positive position within the different formularies and medical policies that control access to those products, and then informing the integrated delivery systems that will be doing their secondary reviews on top of whatever the health plans do, and then presenting that information to the physicians and patients in a consumable manner. There are millions of publications that get put into the press every year, and as a primary care physician, there's no way anyone could potentially keep up with any one therapeutic area, let alone the broad array of subjects that they need to deal with. So presenting the information in a crisp, clear manner that addresses the populations that those physicians are treating will make the information much, much higher utility. And it'll give the patients the confidence that they need to be more compliant and persistent with the therapies that they negotiate with their physician to take. So if there are any questions, comments, can take them now, or we can wait until the discussion panel.
They formulate their comments. Thank you very much. Appreciate you being up here. We'll have you back up here in a minute, and we'll do our facilitated Q&A at that point, or not. We have a question right now.
Okay. So you're doing in the United States, right? And so I'm wondering, if you look at what you do globally, how does that data come into play with the things that you look at?
That's a great question. I think this is really, if you will, a global play. United States is the biggest consumer of drug products in the world, but I think this type of work needs to get done on a global basis. 2 weeks, I'm going to Scotland to meet with a bunch of people in Europe who are going to do the same things in collaboration with us. So we think that, as I said, the evidence needs to meet the needs of the consumer, whoever that is, through their lens. So clearly, European, Asian healthcare delivery systems are very, very different than that of the United States. So in my mind, the biology is similar, although when we talk about the different phenotypes of patients, it may be different, but the value proposition will be different depending upon how they fund and reimburse their healthcare services, and the way that they deliver products to their populations. So I think complementary studies looking at a very broad geography is essential to get a comprehensive understanding of what the impact is. I'm very familiar with some of the healthcare systems in Europe and Asia. Not a global expert by any means, but the way they look at things is very different. And the United States, we don't have a basket or a total budget for healthcare delivery, so our systems are very different. I've never seen too much emphasis put on qualities or other types of metrics that are very, very common in EU. So I think having a broad array of distributed studies using these methodologies will really be the optimal way of doing it.
Thanks for the talk. Very interesting. I'm wondering if you could comment on perhaps what you guys might be doing, looking at perhaps social media and incorporating some of that into some of this discussion that we're having, meaning that there are sites like Patients Like Me, where people are discussing much more freely their medical conditions with other patients that have similar medical conditions, and perhaps much more so openly than they are with their doctors and their healthcare providers. Then we also see the anti-vaxxer movement happening through social media and how that might be affecting healthcare and putting a burden in our healthcare too because of these outbreaks, measles outbreaks and so on. Wondering if you can comment a little bit about what you, if we should be focusing a little bit on some of that and what you guys might be doing.
Oh, I think that's a huge play when we talk about patient factors and system factors in decisions to treat and in compliance. You know, for the first time, at least at HealthCore where we're dealing with, we have full-time people that are focusing on social media. And you know, we're developing a capability to recruit patients to clinical trials. And we're going to be using social media for that. We've reached out to numerous advocacy groups and have asked how we can interact with them. And actually as part of our CoreNet grant and reaching out to those groups so that as we develop the information system architecture on doing our studies, how do we bring in the patient perspective, the patient viewpoint, and as a clinician, as a family doc, how do we push that information out to them? I can't tell you how many calls I get on a daily basis from people looking for patients with XYZ disease that are looking to get involved in studies or ask questions on the validity of certain clinical trials. Social media is critical for appropriate use. Unfortunately, many of the sites are not curated. So there's a lot of smoke and mirrors and a lot of information being distributed. And unless we have the right information to empower primary care physicians and physicians to counter some of that misinformation, it's going to be very, very problematic.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Singer. Dr. Singer will be back up here in a minute. So if you have more questions, be ready.